When most people think about human trafficking, they think about forced prostitution, for good reason. There are 4.5 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. My first exposure to this was 30 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and my job was basically to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, we were finding girls that were 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Couldn't understand what was going on. So we went to go interview them. What we found was basically the same story we called over and over again. And it went something like this. Human trafficker, a guy around 20 years old, would go into a village and flash a bunch of money around. He wanted everyone to think he was rich. He'd then go find a girl, 12, 13 years old, befriend her, and then go to the family and say, I want to marry your daughter. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of our daughter. But that isn't necessarily what's going to happen. A couple of days later, they actually go through the wedding ceremony. After that, he says to the family, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, the capital, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where the brothels are. He puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be back in a couple of hours. She's like, no, 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 no. When I came in, I saw these people. Who are they? Why are they dressed that? No, 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 it's okay. You just stay here. He then goes to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over. He then returns to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in a year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with between 10 and 15 guys a day, every day. You can imagine her shock. No, 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 my husband loves me. No, this is what happened. When many of these girls internalize their situation, they say, I will kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then takes out the photograph of the wedding and says, is this your mother, your father, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation where she's forced into prostitution. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a 2-day period of time, they'll take this girl and rape her 30 or 40 times until eventually she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's put on the line, which means she will be with between 10 and 15 guys a day, every day, until she gets what's called black eye, which is where she's so depleted spiritually and emotionally and physically that nobody wants her. So they throw her out onto the street. So I was hearing this story over and over again, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the government of India to do public health checks. I went from brothel to brothel. I had a policeman with me the entire time that I was there. I went into one brothel, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. She saw this Caucasian guy, saw this opportunity, literally ran up and wrapped herself around me. Said, save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying. I turned to the police officer and said, we need to get her out of here. He said, we can't do that. So what are you talking about? You're a cop. He said, if we try to leave, they'll kill us both. To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. Now, I told that story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that say, when I grow up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be one. But every once in a while, we are tested in life. That was my big test. I failed miserably. And for a long time, I had nightmares, I couldn't sleep, and I did what a lot of activists do. I surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. 30 years later, here I am presenting to you. But it's not just about women and girls. We have men and boys. The typical scenario in Southeast Asia, a 15-year-old boy is told he can go on a fishing boat. The boat's only going to go out for a couple of months. He's going to make a lot of money. He's going to come back. He's going to be a hero for his family. He gets on the boat. He doesn't realize because he's been sold onto the boat. The boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor kid will have to work 17, 18, 19 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets tortured and beaten, food's taken away. The only food he will have the entire time he's there is rice and fish, nothing nutritious. He will be given drugs that stimulate his body. If he gets injured, if he gets sick, They throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes back. He goes to the captain and says, give me something. Captain says, go away. You're illegally in our country. Guy says, I'll tell the police. Captain says, go ahead. We own the police. I'll give you one more example. I lived and worked in Bangladesh for 5 years. And during the time that I was there, we had infants, 2-year-olds, who were trafficked from Bangladesh to the Middle East. Now, those of you who have parents know that a 2-year-old doesn't have the manual dexterity or the concentration to do repetitive work. What do you do with a 2-year-old? You put them on the back of a camel. Why? Because if you put a 2-year-old on the back of the camel, they kick and scream. What does the camel do? It runs. So they race camels, and they bet on them, and they use infants because they are light. By the time the child is 5 years old, assuming they live to that age, because many of them fall and get trampled, he's beginning to gain weight. He's slowing the camel down, so they take this kid and throw him out into the real world to fend for himself. So at a time when most 5-year-olds are beginning their life, you have a 5-year-old boy by himself in a situation where, for the most part, he has to fend for himself. All of these things that we're talking about fall into the category of what we call human trafficking. Now let's talk about human trafficking for a moment. Human trafficking was the terminology that was used because in the early days we had a situation where a person was going from one country to another as examples of what this phenomena was. And so they said we needed a rubric that showed movement. So like drug trafficking, where drugs are taken from one place to another, or arms trafficking, taking from one place to another, human trafficking was the terminology. But over time, what people realized was a situation where, wait a minute, does it matter if a person goes from one country to another, or from one city within a country to another, or from one side of the street to another? Isn't it more of a relevance that if a person doesn't get paid, if they can't leave, if there's violence and threats, shouldn't we focus on the exploitation? So over time, what happened is human trafficking was switched over to slavery. But then people said, well, wait a minute, slavery happened a long time ago. So they put the word modern next to it. So human trafficking is the means to which a person gets into the outcome, which is modern slavery, and we're hearing about that all over the world. So, okay, so we have slaves in the world. Some people might ask the question, well, we may have some in Africa, Latin America. There's got to be a few thousand of them. Actually, there's a lot more than that. There's over 40 million people in modern slavery. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. More slaves today than any other time in history. 62% of them are here in Asia, basically for two reasons. There's a lot of Asians. China, 1.37 billion people. India, 1.27 billion people. Then you have Pakistan, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, all have large populations. Second, you have remnants of feudal systems that have never been completely dismantled all across Asia. You go to Beijing, very well-running modern city, go 20 kilometers outside, and what you will find are these feudal systems that exist that exploit people that have been there for almost ever. When it comes to the 40 million, we have it broken down into a couple of subsets. About 38% of them is forced marriage. This is where people are forced to enter into a marriage to work. And 62% of them would be in forced labor. And then when you break that down again, you find that 19% of them would be in forced prostitution, 64% in more traditional fishing boats, agriculture type situations. And so we're able to now count and look at the numbers of people who are in these circumstances, and that gives us a general sense of what the problem is. Another thing that's really interesting about this is the fact that with all of the variations on human trafficking, in some cases you have things that are more labor related, like fishing boats and sweatshops, and others that have less of a labor and emphasis, forced marriage or begging. Or you have a situation where an individual, like a domestic helper, is by themselves, or you have people in a situation where they're working in a sweatshop with many other people. Because of this variation, it's very difficult to come up with interventions in order to address modern slavery. In terms of the number of people who are adding to this number over time, in a year, 9.2 million people, in a day, about 25,000 people, or in the time it takes us to do this presentation, approximately 1,000 people will enter modern slavery around the world. The last statistic that always gets me is that there's a new slave every 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Somewhere in the world you have somebody entering into modern slavery, and the drug beats on and on and on. When it comes down to a breakdown between kind of forced prostitution and forced labor, most people think that what we're talking about here is forced prostitution because we hear that so often. But in reality, over 80% of what we're dealing with here is forced labor. And as it relates to us as consumers, 60% of that number are associated with the electronics, the footwear, the apparel, the food, the fish that we buy. So as consumers, we are contributing to modern slavery because of our consumer behavior. We don't always know when we're buying something that might be tainted by modern slavery, but for the most part, we've all contributed to that. And like the kind of emphasis in the environmental movement of the carbon footprint being part of us, we also are contributing to human trafficking as consumers. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about how it is that people get into modern slavery. And the first one is deception. And this represents about 85% of what we're talking about. Imagine if you were a person and somebody came to you and said, I'll give you $1 million for a job. You only have to work 4 days a week. You can have 2 hours off for lunch. I'll give you a house, a car, 3 months of vacation, and you can live everywhere in the world you want. If it was real, everybody would be excited about that. It's a great opportunity. But most of us would be thinking, is this too good to be true? Well, in reality, most times it isn't. But imagine if you're in a situation where basically you are a migrant and you've never made more than $2 a day, and somebody comes up and says, I'll give you $4. And instead of working 16 and a half hours, you only have to work 15 hours, and I'll give you 2 hours off on Sunday. But you have to make the decision right now. So maybe the person's thinking sounds too good to be true. But what if it isn't? What if it's that one time in a person's life when they get a break, the person can get a motorcycle, a tin roof, and so many people accept this, get taken away, and then they're forced into a situation. The second is debt. So in this particular situation, let's say a person needed $1,500 for an operation for their family member, Hong Kong dollars. Didn't have the money, went to a loan shark, borrowed the money. Operation took place, it was very successful. After that, he tries to pay the loan shark back with $2,000. $2,000, I need $20,000. Now you may basically say that's not fair. Well, what we're dealing with here are criminals. They don't have to be fair. So oftentimes what happens is people get cheated in this indebted situation, and they get into a situation where for the most part, they will be forced to pay this back. They get in a situation where they're made to basically work, and that's how they hold people in place. When it comes to kidnapping, a lot of us think that's how people get into human trafficking. It happens, but not very often. Partly because if you trick or deceive or force a person into human trafficking against their will, and they're going kicking and screaming, somebody might see it. So most people who enter into human trafficking are deceived. When it comes to the things that are used to address modern slavery, there are basically 3 interventions. The first one is prevention, and prevention is exactly what it sounds like. You try to prevent a person from getting into human trafficking. And so we have programs all over Asia that basically go and try to get migrants not to migrate from one place to another because of the potential risks that exist in there. But the problem with this approach is that most migrants who have been trafficked, who come back, lie about their experience. So it's very difficult to find somebody who's saying, yes, I did this, it got bad for me. And so as a result of that, a lot of people don't take the advice and guidance. The second is using legal systems to go after bad guys. The trouble with this is that human trafficking isn't one crime like a rape or a robbery or murder. It's multiple crimes that are put together. And there's almost formulas that have to be used to determine whether or not a person is a trafficking victim or not. And so it's very confusing for law enforcement. And so a lot of law enforcement people don't feel it's really their job to go after forced labor type situations. The last situation is protection. And in this, you basically have a person who has been trafficked, and afterwards, somebody comes and takes them to a shelter, somebody helps them out, somebody gives them the skills and the means to be able to move on with their life. All of these different interventions are used by the counter-trafficking world to address the issue. Now, when it comes to who's supposed to be addressing these problems, it's supposed to be governments. But a lot of governments don't like this topic. It's embarrassing for the government of Hong Kong or for Thailand or Cambodia or Indonesia to have slaves. Many of them do things, but not nearly the number of things that they need to do in order to make a difference. I worked for the United Nations for years. I'll put my hand on my heart when I say this. I believe in the United Nations system. But I spent a lot of time in five-star hotels, eating really good food, basically talking about poverty. There was a real disconnect between what we were supposed to do and what we were actually doing. So the groups that are doing most of the work are the NGOs, the non-government organizations that are out there on the front lines, working with the victims, trying to shut down these programs and so forth. So if we stop and look at the statistics, 81% of what we're talking about is forced labor, and 60% of that is associated with supply chains. This is where our food comes from. This is where basically we get our electronics and so forth. Another group that has to be involved in this is the private sector. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector hates it because they're often on the receiving end of somebody pointing a finger and saying, it's because of your greed that you would actually use slavery in order to get shareholder profits. In reality, this is not the case. Private sector would never do that, but consumers believe that, and that's a big problem for the private sector. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the report card for the number of people who basically have been helped last year out of modern slavery. There's 40 million people. How many of them got out last year with all of the NGOs and governments and public sector activities taking place? Then I'm going to show you out of 500,000 criminals, how many criminals basically went to jail. Think about what a good number would be. And here are the results. Last year, out of 40 million people, only 100,000 people were helped. That's 0.2% of the victims, not even 1%. Out of 500,000 criminals, you had a situation where only about 8,000 of them were put in jail, 0.8%. When you look at those statistics, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are they lazy? Are they not doing what they're supposed to do? Well, that's not the issue. The issue is this. The profits generated from modern slavery are estimated to be $150 billion a year. The amount of money that's used to fight it is about $350 million, or 0.23% of the profits. To put this into perspective, in the United States, we eat a lot of potato chips, $6 billion worth of potato chips a year. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in the United States to come up with the amount of money that's used globally to address modern slavery. So the profits are this big, the amount of money to fight it is this big. You can see what it is that we're up against. Another thing is the scale. There's only about 15,000 do-gooder types that work for the NGOs and the governments that work on this full time compared to 500,000 greed-incentivized criminals. We have to follow rules and regulations. We have to do things according to a plan. If they find that anyone's coming after them, they can mutate and they can change in a millisecond. When it comes to this particular topic, when we present to the private sector, we often have people express disbelief. You NGO types are always coming up with these numbers. They don't believe it's actually happening. And if you have a receptive audience, then they will accept information. But if they don't accept the premise that there's 40 million people, it's really difficult to convince them. And lastly, we have a situation where general awareness of this is very low. So if I were in front of an audience, I would ask, how many of you knew even 20% of what I was talking about? And generally, I get very few hands because most people haven't been exposed to this. If you haven't been exposed to it, you're not going to care. If you're not caring, you're not going to do anything. So it's really important for people to have a better understanding of this particular modern slavery and how it works. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about the private sector and the relevance of the private sector to forced labor. Now, a lot of the discussion that I'm going to give you started as a result of that number, 0.2%. When governments in the United Nations came to realize that basically the public sector was not having much impact on addressing modern slavery, they went back to the numbers and realized many of the people associated with forced labor were associated with supply chains. So they said, we have to bring the private sector in. As a result of that, what we saw is a situation where private sector was drawn in not willingly, but through basically trends that created a business risk, because most people felt like the only way you're going to get the private sector involved is if you create risk. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing. The first trend is expanding legislation. So prior to 2012, we had a situation where periodically governments and businesses and the United Nations would come together, they would debate and discuss human rights issues, modern slavery, and then often they'd come up with a report, and they'd put that report out, they'd pat each other on the back. It would be available, but very few people used it because there was no incentive to use it. There was no reason to do things. So gradually over time, we saw legislation that was introduced. The first legislation was the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act. What this act basically said is that if you're a big company and you have profits of $100 million in either retail or manufacturing, and you have a single product in California, you basically have to say on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all, and you say that, you're in compliance, but you have to say something. The purpose of this legislation was transparency, to allow consumers basically to see what companies are doing or not doing. What happened a couple of years later is the UK Modern Slavery Act came in. What they did is they lowered the ceiling from 100 million to 36 million pounds, but they added two additional things. Number one, an annual report, and that annual report has to be signed by the board of directors. What that did is elevated this issue from the compliance level to the board level. And then we saw the French legislation came in, Australian legislation, and we see pending legislation coming in the EU and Canada. But the transition is from initially just having transparency to annual reports to a situation where it's becoming more punitive. The Canadian legislation is actually saying if you are found to have forced labor in your business, you will be fined and penalized. We haven't seen that before. The second thing we're seeing is lawsuits. What we're seeing mostly are retailers who buy large quantities of possible commodities that are tainted with modern slavery being sued because they're doing that. And the plaintiffs want them to use their influence to make things better. In one case, there was actually a situation where the plaintiffs wanted there to be on the side of the tuna fish a clause that said this product could be tainted by modern slavery. Now, if you were a consumer, you went into a grocery store and picked that up, I don't think you're going to buy that product. So obviously, this creates a business risk for that organization. When it comes to the cocoa industry, they've been sued for years, partly because in Africa, where the beans come from, it's often fraught with child labor and forced labor circumstances. So a situation where lawsuits can get a lot of publicity is a business risk. It leads to the potential for naming and shaming. Another trend that we see is increased media coverage. What we're seeing is that articles and exposés related to modern slavery are nearly doubling every year for the past 5 years. Now, in the 1990s, you couldn't pick up a paper and not read something about HIV/AIDS. Nearly every day we saw articles and exposés on that because it was a phenomena. It was a period of time that focused on that. When was the last time you saw an HIV/AIDS story? What happened is the environmental movement came and replaced that, did that for 15 years, and now the new issue of our time is modern slavery. So what we're seeing is that environmental coverage is going down, modern slavery is going up, because people are interested in the topic. They want to know about the topic. And so you will expect to see more and more of this over time. And this could last for quite some time. People want to get their teeth into it. People want to see what's being done to address it. Another one is that there are consumer groups that professionally work in order to name and shame companies into doing something. There's this one particular organization, I won't mention them, that has a list of 9 million people on their database. When they think that a company is doing something wrong, they send to each of those 9 million people a message saying, can you send an email or a letter to this company? In this particular case, what we're seeing here is palm oil. And so this company went after a particular organization, got all of these people to send these emails. Imagine if you worked for that company, you had a great weekend, you come in on a Monday, you open up your email, and you find 9 million angry emails. You can imagine that this isn't a good thing for that company, and it obviously has the potential to hurt their reputation. The last thing is the investment world. So for a long time, investment companies didn't care much about the world. And then there was a lot of emphasis on the environment and a lot of emphasis on our companies fair to their employees and so forth. And so what was called ESG was set up. E is environmental, G is governance, S is social. The E and the G are fairly well established in that they have metrics to address this. But the S side never really had that much in the way of metrics. And so what are happening now is you're finding that teachers' unions are beginning to ask the question, how do we know that our retirement fund isn't supporting modern slavery? So what we're beginning to see is an emphasis on companies asking the questions, how do we ensure that if we are investing in a particular manufacturer, that there isn't a problem? And so the SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals that are used to measure kind of the impactor things, and the ESG are coming together. And there's an emphasis on trying to measure investments to ensure that there isn't any tainting associated with it in modern slavery. And the reason for this is simple. There's a large number of people who are millennials now who really do care about the world. In fact, 84% of the millennials say that they value the investments that they have. In addition to that, the millennials in the next decade are going to be overseeing over $30 trillion in investment. And so as they move into this space, bringing their morals and their ethics into it, you're going to see more of an emphasis on this. So all of these things that we're talking about here have created an incentive for governments to get the private sector to be involved in addressing modern slavery. And this trend has kind of transcended the banking world, the retail world, the manufacturing world, the hospitality world. Many hotels don't realize that this issue of modern slavery has relevance to them. They see this as being something that is within, say, the banking world or the manufacturing world. But in reality, there is vulnerability. Part of the reason for this is that there's just very little awareness of what modern slavery is within the hotel world. If you don't know about something, you can't understand the vulnerability of it, and so it's really important for this awareness to be in place. To just give you a sense of kind of the areas that are vulnerable, you have supply chains because hotels buy seafood, and they buy linen, and they buy furniture. You have the potential for forced prostitution to take place within the hotel. You have the possibility of people who work within the hotel who come from other countries having fraudulent contracts that can be exploitative. And even within the construction sector, you have the possibility of people being exploited. All of these are relevant to the hotel industry, but once again, many hotels don't know much about it. So let's go through these quickly. When it comes to supply chains, one of the vulnerabilities is seafood. Many hotels have restaurants that buy large quantities of seafood. What we're seeing now is that many retailers are being sued. It hasn't happened to hotels yet, but there's always that possibility that somebody will make a connection between seafood that is exploitative and a hotel. And so hotels recognize this vulnerability, and they're in the process of doing things. Part of this process is to go and talk to the suppliers to understand what the suppliers are doing and so forth. So some of the risk factors that hotels have is, number one, they have contracts between their organization and suppliers that don't mention any language related to modern slavery. If that language isn't there, that basically explicitly says that you can't have any relationship with modern slavery, it poses a risk for the hotel. If they were to go down to the sites where these locations take place, another risk might be that some of these employees don't have their documentation. They are actually being held in place by somebody holding their documents and saying, we're not going to give it back, you have to stay here in this type of situation. Another indicator that we're seeing hotels that go to the suppliers will see that the living quarters of where the people are who are working there are in an abysmal situation. They're just horrific. If a company that is supporting employees doesn't care enough to have living standards that meets a living standard, you have a situation where there may be this vulnerability. So what we're seeing hotels do is basically mapping out their supply chains. They are looking at the companies that are providing the seafood and asking questions. Who are your sub-suppliers and your sub-sub-suppliers? And how are you, as a company, tracking to ensure that there's no exploitation taking place? Another thing they're doing is what's called a social audit, where they will hire a third-party contractor who goes into the supplier's supply chain and goes as deep as they can to identify if there's any vulnerability. And there are many vulnerabilities associated with modern slavery. It could be that the documents are taken, that contracts aren't in place, that indebtedness is there. So these types of social audits allow for the possibility of determining whether these issues exist. Third-party contracts. Let's say you have a hotel in a location that doesn't have a lot of local people who want to clean the rooms or provide security or dishwashing and so forth. And so another vulnerability is what we call third-party contracts. This could be with services like dishwashing or security, various other things that are happening within a particular hotel. And oftentimes these people come from other countries. So let's give as an example a person who is approached from Nepal. A risk factor could be the recruiter goes into the village and says, you're making $30 a month. How would you like to make $200 a month? What do I have to do? Well, what you need to do is to sign up with us. We will get a passport. We'll train you. We will get you on a plane. We'll get you to that location. And then you're going to make a lot of money and life is going to be good. What do I have to do? Well, you have to give us $1,500. Well, I don't have $1,500. Doesn't matter. We'll take care of it. So what they do is they lull the person into thinking that that money can be paid back very quickly. What they don't understand, though, is that all kinds of fees and penalties are added along the way. And by the time the person gets to that third country, basically they're in a situation where the indebtedness results in them working for years and not getting any money at all. That's debt bondage. That's a form of modern slavery. Another situation is where a person signs a contract, let's go back to Nepal, in Nepalese, but when they get to the destination country, the contract that they are given is in another language. The person says, well, I already signed a contract. You got to sign this one. I can't read it. You sign this or you're going to lose everything. They sign the contract, and basically what happens is they are in a situation where that contract exploits them. All kinds of fees and penalties and costs that weren't included. That's another way of basically taking advantage of employees. So when it comes to a situation where you have an employee who has an expectation, but when they get to the destination, all kinds of things are added to it, this results in a situation of what we call modern slavery. So when it comes to how hotels are addressing this, one of the things they're doing is if an employee comes from another country, they provide a lot of training to them. They help that person to understand that they have rights. And if they find that that person is indebted, they need to have some type of a policy in place that determines what they are going to do. In some cases, they will pay that debt. In other cases, they insist that the recruitment agency basically address that cost. And so what we're talking about here is instilling a sense of what's called responsible recruitment, whereby when an employee arrives, there is no debt associated with their experience. They can just start working, and they are going to have the benefits of whatever that particular business is offering. And that's another direction that we're seeing companies go in. When it comes to prostitution, we know that people use hotels for prostitution. In fact, what we're seeing in North America is this is becoming a big business risk, because what we're seeing is that motels and hotels in the United States are actually being sued. A 14-year-old girl who was forced into prostitution went to a particular hotel for a couple of weeks. She's rescued. She knows the hotel. They sue the hotel because they say the hotel should have known better. And so what has happened as a result of this is a scenario whereby these lawsuits are taking place. They're being lost by the hotels, and the insurance industry is now going to the hotels and saying, we're not sure whether or not we can insure you because of this vulnerability. To put this into perspective, This is data that comes from the United States that looks at where sex trafficking victims have been helped in the United States, and you can see it's massive. So what we're dealing with here is a big problem. And if this problem goes to Europe and Asia in terms of lawsuits against hotels, you're going to have a real problem for the hotel industry. So what we're seeing is that hotels are beginning to ask the question, what is our responsibility when it comes to addressing prostitution in our hotel? Do we approach the clients? Do we not approach them? Many of them feel very shy about doing this, partly because they're afraid that they might offend people. But if the legislation is moving in that direction, eventually they won't have a choice. The second part of the process is to identify what is the policy if you find a red flag or a scenario that looks like a forced prostitution is taking place. Who do you contact within the hotel? Is it the manager, the concierge? Does a phone call get made to the local police? That particular process needs to be done. And last, the employees within the hotel need to be trained. So if they see certain things that are unusual, that don't seem right, they can report this to whoever it is that's identified as doing this. So there are things that are called red flags or indicators to determine whether or not forced prostitution might take place. For example, if you see a young girl coming in with an older person, that might be a red flag. If that person isn't able to talk to anyone else, that could be a red flag. If they have no luggage, that could be a red flag. When it comes to perpetrators, if they are basically coming and going from that room, if we're seeing a lot of men entering the room, if they're asking for a lot of towels but won't let anyone in to clean or to kind of inspect what's going on, there may be something nefarious taking place. So this is used to train people so that the staff, when they see it, they know what to do. They'll go to the concierge, they go to the manager. These red flags are an important part of the process, understanding them. The third area is construction. Now, a lot of hotels are made in certain locations that don't necessarily have good oversight. An example of a construction kind of modern slavery situation is something like this. A person goes to the construction site, says, I'm looking for a job. Foreman says, I'll give you a job. I will pay you a certain amount of money, but I can't pay you right away. Maybe can't pay you for 3 months. 3 months goes by, the person goes up to the manager, says, I'd like to be paid. Sorry, I need another 2 months. Then it's another 2 months, and it's another 2 months. It eventually gets to a point where this person is so desperate and they're so indebted that they raise the pressure on the manager. The manager makes a call to the local immigration police. They come, they pick this person up, and then they deport them. So there's an arrangement that is often made as part of this. But as a result of this situation, many people end up working for an entire year and they don't get paid anything at all. So when it comes to addressing these issues, hotels often have kind of a checklist that addresses all 4 of those factors to determine what do they need to do in order to protect their business. What safeguards need to be put in place? How are they going to ensure that there's no exploitation that's taking place? So this allows them to think through, to plan, to identify, and then determine what they need to do in order to address this problem. And this is the direction that we're seeing a lot of hotels go in now.
We are the Mekong Club. We are a catalyst for change, engaging, inspiring and supporting the private sector to lead in the fight against modern slavery. We are a Hong Kong-based NGO. We work with organisations in a positive, collaborative, non-naming and shaming way to identify opportunities for change. We have a business association of 4 working groups that cover financial services, hospitality, retail and apparel and footwear, as well as a number of cross-sector industry initiatives. Together, we convene these groups on a regular basis. We create a safe space for companies to come together, to share best practice, to share the challenges and the roadblocks that they're facing when it comes to combating this issue. We work with these companies to develop tools, resources, innovative projects designed to tackle these challenges and move forward their industries as a whole. Our corporate tools are available for our members, and they're designed to guide companies through a journey when it comes to combating modern slavery. We start by understanding modern slavery. Often companies need to start here because they need to know what this issue is, how it affects them, how it affects their industry, and the steps that they should be taking in order to combat it. Next, we work with companies to enhance and develop very specific policies and procedures to combat modern slavery. We work on their road mapping, their anti-slavery strategies, and we review documents to ensure their business response is as strong as it should be. Modern slavery is pure profit. We want to crowd out these bad actors. And to do that, we sit with companies and we assess and mitigate the risks that they find within their operations. We work with companies to understand where the risk lies. We help them carry out investigations and develop remediation plans to ensure that if and when they do find issues, they are dealt with appropriately and with victim care at the very center of everything that they do. We want to build capacity for companies. We work to develop their employees' skills. We train them, we develop them. We want them to become proactive in leading the fight against modern slavery, not just reacting to issues that have already happened. And finally, every single member of the Mekong Club should become an industry leader in this space. We work with companies, we get them to share best practice. They demonstrate to their peers that modern slavery can be eradicated without an impact on profitability. I'm now going to walk you through some highlights of our tools and resources that we have available to members at the Mekong Club. We have an e-learning platform. So this is a comprehensive platform of videos available in multiple languages. They are short videos coupled with infographics and quizzes designed to teach employees what modern slavery is, key legislation, terminology, testimonials from survivors, as well as very specific information on how this issue affects their industry. These videos are available in multiple languages. They're being used by companies in countries across the world. And also companies are able to use these videos to help educate their suppliers. We have developed a knowledge hub. Now, this is a carefully curated library of resources and news articles related to modern slavery. We update this on a regular basis, and it provides you with the most relevant, the most up-to-date information related to this issue. You can go into the Knowledge Hub, you can search by keyword, by country, by commodity, to find what you need quickly and easily. We also provide our members with monthly digests of the most relevant news and resources every single month straight into their inbox. Our Transparency in Supply Chains legislation tool breaks down the very complex world of modern slavery legislation into bite-sized pizzas. It gives summaries of the legislation and what the expectations are on your company in order to comply. It outlines exactly who is affected, what the requirements are for reporting, as well as any potential penalties for non-compliance. Crucially, we also provide best practice examples and common mistakes that companies make when they're adhering to this legislation, to ensure we're improving as an industry as a whole. Our remediation toolkit has been developed to prepare companies. Chances are you are going to find risk or issues within your operations related to modern slavery. You need a plan in place to deal with this. Our remediation toolkit guides you through preparing a remediation plan and communicating this plan effectively with key stakeholders, so your suppliers, your employees, workers in supply chains. It then guides you on how to investigate potential cases of modern slavery and then remedy them in such a way where your business continues to thrive, but you also continue to support those victims that have been found within supply chains and ensure this issue does not arise in the same way ever again. At Mekong Club, we are passionate about generating thought leadership, about furthering the anti-slavery conversation between ourselves, our peers, and other organizations. We take our projects and we assess them on a regular basis. We report on what works, what doesn't work, where we think anti-slavery strategy is going in the future. All of our thought leadership and our research pieces are available online. Increasingly, asset managers and investors are starting to care about this issue. ESG investment is designed to measure whether or not a company or investment can be considered to be ethical. Well, currently, modern slavery within the S or social element of ESG is really lacking. We have come up with a set of indicators that can be used to assess a company's performance in their anti-slavery strategy. ESG indicators. These have been designed to be used by asset managers and to really reward those companies that are taking these steps in combating slavery. We have a number of technology-based innovation projects that we have developed in response to the challenges and the issues put forward by our working groups. Our research indicates a number of problems with the social audit process as it stands. Currently, when a social auditor goes into a factory to interview a worker, they may be interviewing them in front of a room of 20 of their peers, also potentially in a language that is not the first language of that particular worker. This makes it quite challenging to get the information that they need, and it also means there are privacy issues, as workers may not feel comfortable to talk about the reality of their situation when in front of their peers or even their management, especially in the case where they might be in a forced labour situation. The AppRise Audit app has been developed to combat this. So the auditor can bring the app into a factory or a location where they're looking to interview workers. The workers are given a headset, and they're able to listen to questions that have been developed in line with the ILO indicators of forced labour and answer on a phone in a private way. This data is then aggregated, and any red flags are displayed so that follow-up action and remediation action can take place. Another issue that we found within the kind of auditing process that's been put forward by our working groups is that of migrant worker employment documentation. We have instances where workers' employment contracts are confiscated, they might be changed, or they might not even exist at all. So we've developed the EMIN app. Now, this is a blockchain-enabled solution that allows for the recording and sharing of key migrant worker documentation using blockchain technology. It empowers the workers with a copy of their own information that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise have. And it also moves us away from a very heavily paper-based process that's prone to fraud, that's prone to error, or that's prone to abuse. Join the Mekong Club to tap into our network of industry experts. We can come to your offices. We can educate your staff on these issues. We can talk with your senior leadership and explain to them just how important their decisions are. We can review your policies, procedures, your anti-slavery strategies, and you will join a network of individuals that are experts in this field. We learn from each other, we share best practice, we share examples, and we learn and grow together. The Mekong Club is dedicated to uniting and inspiring the private sector in the fight against modern slavery. Join us, join our network, sign up your company to our working groups. Together, we can end modern slavery.
I'd like to conclude with a story. This story will put into perspective kind of my feelings about what is modern slavery and what needs to be done to address it. So years ago, when I was living and working in Nepal, I desperately wanted to do something to help, so I decided I was going to write a book. As part of this book writing process, I went from shelter to interview the women and the girls in order to get the information that I needed. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Geeta, and every time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to talk to you. But she sat and listened to all of the other kind of discussions that I had. When I finished up there, I stood up and I was walking towards the door, and Geeta comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You can have my story. I was thrilled. Geeta sat on one side of the table, the rest of us sat on the other side of the table. In over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I had ever heard related to modern slavery. It was filled with rape and torture and disease and betrayal. She said she was raped 7,000 times and that she was dying of AIDS. At the end of this story, I honestly didn't know what to say. I paused. Finally, I turned to her and I said, wow, Geeta, you must be so angry at those human traffickers for the horrific things they did to you. She paused and paused. Then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help her. Nobody came. She said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that everything around her was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything about it. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society, for not caring enough to allow a young girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times. Now, I tell this story because Gita inherently understood that in order to address this issue, it's not going to be a small number of people. The issue and the problem is too big, and we need everyone to come together. And so at present, we have the NGOs, and we have the governments, and we have kind of the United Nations. But what we're trying to do now is to add the private sector. Why? Because the private sector has something to offer. You have the skills, the means, the problem-solving ability, the resources, the networks to make a difference. And so we, the Mekong Club, believe that we should be working with the private sector in a positive, supportive way because we recognize the potential that the private sector has. And so that's part of the reason why we emphasize private sector involvement, because we're only helping 0.2% of the victims. We need to get that up to 2%, then up to 20%. We need to make a difference, and we need the private sector to be a part of that process. But I also say to people that after listening to this talk, there are things that you can do. And I often ask my audience to do one thing. If they do one thing in a year, they're doing something. Now, people might ask, what is it that I can do? Well, one thing you can do is to learn about this issue. Guess what? You watched this video. You learned about this. You've done your one thing. You don't have to go out and do anything else. How easy was that? But if you were to stop and tell 2 other people what you've done a second thing, and a third thing, and a fourth thing. So it's easy to contribute. You don't have to quit your job and go to Cambodia and work in a shelter. There are simple things we can all do. Another thing is, within your company, participate in the discussions and the meetings to address this particular issue related to modern slavery. You can volunteer. You can basically go and work for an NGO in your community. You can do it in their office, or you can do it remotely. Even doing internet searches in order to collect information is a viable thing that you can do. These are all small things that add up. You can use your innovative skills. If you are a technical person, you can help with app development, the application of technology, design issues, any number of things you can do. You can give a donation. A small donation given to an organization can make a big difference. For example, in Cambodia, it costs about $3 a day to keep somebody in a shelter. Maybe the state will pay for 2 weeks. Maybe they need another 2 weeks. A small contribution, giving up a meal, taking that money and donating it makes a difference. Or you can fundraise within your organization. All of these things add up if lots of people do it. And I often say if 10 million people did these types of activities, that's 10 million compassionate, supportive gestures that adds up to something quite big. Now, the last thing I'd like to say is to end with a story specifically related to the private sector. And it relates to the banking industry, but it's relevant to all of the other sectors that we work with. So I was at a conference, and I presented to the American Banking Association. And this guy comes up afterwards and said, "Mr. Friedman, I want to talk to you." I said, "Sure." Went off to the side. He says, "I want to tell you a story. I was with my wife and my 2 teenage daughters, and we were going from one state to another. And about halfway to this other state, we stopped to go into a motel. I got my wife and my 2 daughters settled. I went out to get food, and I saw this 14-year-old girl being dragged into a room. And I knew it was forced prostitution, and it was nefarious, and it was bad, and it really bothered me. I have teenage daughters. So I went to the manager, not knowing if anything was going to happen. She called the police. 20 minutes later, there was a police car there. 20 minutes later, this guy is being taken out in handcuffs. The girl's being taken away to the shelter. He said, this was a milestone in my life. It was one of the most important moments of my life because I really helped somebody. So I turned to him and I said, well, what do you do? He says, well, I'm in the banking world. I said, yeah, I get that. You're in a banking conference, but what do you do for the banks? And he said, I do anti-money laundering. I work on corruption cases, fraud cases. I asked him if he ever did cases related to human trafficking. So yeah, all the time. I said, dude, you do this work all the time. Every time you basically do what you need to do, it helps to identify a criminal activity, and the possibility of that same outcome happening happens. He didn't make the connection between what he was doing and the relevance and importance of this. But once he had that in his mind, it was as important as when he helped that girl at the motel. Now, I told this story in Singapore in front of a lot of bankers, and I had probably 20 people come up to me and say, nobody's really talked about the relevance and the importance of the work that we do in addressing modern slavery, but now we see it, and it makes us feel good. So whether you're working in a bank, whether you're working in a hotel, whether you're working in a retail site or a manufacturing site, if you are able to use your organizations and your skills and your procedures to identify forced labor and to address it, you are in fact contributing to making the world a better place. You are being heroic. And I want to emphasize this because the private sector has the potential to be major players in addressing this. And you can still make a profit, you can still do your work, you can still sell your products, but at the same time, you can ensure that people aren't being exploited in the workplace. And that's the importance of why we need to get in front of the private sector to help them to understand this issue so that they can address these things when they find it.